Hello? Professional broadcaster here. Yes, thank you. Good evening. Welcome to the Newsmakers Series, hosted by the Center for Community and Ethnic Media here at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism. I'm Errol Lewis, the Director of Urban Reporting here at the J School. I'm also the political anchor at New York One News. Joining me on today's panel are Abigail Savage-Liu, who is a staff writer at City Limits, and Stefan Johnson, a staff writer at the New York Amsterdam News. Our center's co-director, Jahangir Kadek, is here as well. And if you're nice to him, he'll show you their fancy new offices at some point. And they're new offices. I haven't seen them. They may or may not be fancy. The Newsmakers Series, for those who have not been here before, is an on-the-record conversation between city leaders and the city's community and ethnic media. You, of course, serve as a bridge between the mainstream of the city and immigrant communities and communities of color that often don't get as much attention as they should. This is one of many programs offered by the Center for Community and Ethnic Media, which also provides professional development, research, and overall leadership for this important sector. You can find out more about the center online at ccem.journalism.cuny.edu. Our newsmaker today, I am happy to say, is Maria Torres-Springer, Commissioner of the city's Department of Housing Preservation and Development. And in that capacity, she is the point person leading Mayor Bill de Blasio's 10-year housing plan, which is an initiative to create or preserve 200,000 affordable homes and apartments. Commissioner Torres-Springer previously served as president of the New York City Economic Development Corporation. Earlier in her career, she was chief of staff at that agency, and she also formerly served as commissioner of the New York City Department of Small Business Services. We thank her for joining us this afternoon, and here's the format of the discussion. I'll ask Commissioner Torres-Springer to spend about 5 minutes to give us some opening remarks about some of the current initiatives that are going on in her office. And then Abby, Stefan, and I are going to ask some questions. While that is going on, Jahangir will be circulating and collecting the index cards with your questions. He's passing out the cards now, and we'll get some of those questions in as well. At the conclusion of the event, the commissioner will step outside this room for any news organizations that need a quick follow-up or to take some photos. The rest of us will remain here for a short meeting. So with all of that said, let's begin. Commissioner, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Errol. Good afternoon, everyone. First, I would like to thank the Center for Community and Ethnic Media and CUNY Graduate School of Journalism for having me here today. The role that the media plays in the lives of New Yorkers and the lives of Americans, in particular community and ethnic media, perhaps now more than ever, is just so critical. And so I'm really thrilled that I have the opportunity to speak with all of you. So I'm about 3.5 months, maybe a little bit longer, in the role at HPD. I'll take a few minutes to talk about what we've been up to and what we believe are the opportunities and challenges ahead. But I thought we'd start with just a little bit of background because I think it informs how I'm approaching the role and how we're tackling challenges. So I've played different roles in the administration, but for me, in many ways, coming to HPD is a little bit of a homecoming. My first job in New York City was working for an organization called Local Initiative Support Corporation, an intermediary really supporting the development of affordable housing. But perhaps even more importantly, I grew up in Section 8 housing in California. And so our family, for as long as I can remember, really relied on a Section 8 rental assistance voucher in order to make ends meet. And the story that I like to tell is that I remember the feeling the night before each annual inspection by the Alameda County Housing Authority. It was an important inspection. If it didn't go well, there was always a possibility that we would lose that voucher. And I remember the feeling that I have, my parents had kind of in their stomach that night, and it's a feeling that I carry with me every day in my work. And I think that's important. It causes a little bit of stress, but carrying that feeling allows me to never lose track of what's at stake in terms of the work that we do. Because a lot of our work in affordable housing really is a lifeline for struggling families across the city. And so with a little bit of that intro, just to touch on a number of initiatives and pushes at HPD at this moment. So as most of you know, HPD has a very, very broad mission. We have code inspectors who fan the 5 boroughs each and every day, responding to 311 calls, proactively enforcing the city's housing and maintenance code. We oversee a very large stock of existing affordable housing buildings that have regulatory agreements with the city. We finance new construction and preservation of affordable housing. And of course, one of our major missions, as Errol mentioned, is the implementation of the mayor's housing plan. It's the most aggressive housing plan in the entire country, 200,000 units over the course of 10 years. And I'm happy to report, a lot due to the efforts, of course, of my predecessor and the incredible team at HPD, that we've made terrific progress towards the plan's goals. We've financed 63,398 affordable units on time and ahead of schedule and on budget. Of those 63,000 units financed to date, a full 29%, that's about almost 18,000, are serving households making less than 43,000 for a family of 3. And 15% of those units serving New Yorkers making less than 26,000 for a family of 3. So we're reaching deep levels of affordability, while at the same time, of course, trying to make sure we are serving the needs of families at different income levels so that we preserve the economic diversity that makes our neighborhoods so dynamic. But recognizing that we have to do more despite that progress, this past January, the mayor set new targets, actually, to increase the housing for the lowest income New Yorkers. He added $2 billion to our capital budget, so now it's a total of $10 billion, so that 25% of the plan, a full 50,000 units, will be dedicated to extremely low and very low income families. That is a big portion of our work, the implementation of the housing plan, but we know at HPD that the crisis that we are facing in terms of affordability is much more than just building housing. The mayor has really tasked us with not operating in silos, and to give an example of that, and I spoke with Errol last night on his show, we released the plan for Brownsville, for instance. It's a neighborhood plan after a year-long engagement process, 60 initiatives, $1 billion in investment, $150 million in city support to build as a cornerstone 2,500 units of affordable housing, but really trying to tackle all of the other goals that the community has told us over the course of the last year that they want to really address. Better health outcomes, more thriving retail, more job opportunities, better streets, et cetera. And so we're very excited about that plan, but I think what it represents is a new approach to doing this work. At the same time, we are working to address the very real fears of residents about being displaced from their homes. In my travels and talking to residents about their experiences, there's both the very actual displacement, either due to illegal activity and harassment, due to market pressures, or just the fear of displacement. All of this is very real. And it's because of that that we've developed in the administration a very robust set of policy tools to address the various forms of displacement that people face. First and foremost, it's about our preservation work. 60% of the plan, 60% of the 200,000 units will be towards the preservation of affordable homes for long periods of time so that we lock that in for generations to come. We're also doing so much working with other agencies focused on tenant protection and anti-harassment. So that includes a lot of our aggressive work in our Office of Enforcement and Neighborhood Services, enforcing the housing code, bringing lots and lots of cases in housing court in terms of our housing litigation work, working with the state, the AG's office, HCR, in the Tenant Harassment Prevention Task Force, where we are really able to better coordinate and investigate instances of harassment. The other part of this is understanding what the full equation in terms of affordability really entails. So there's people's ability to afford the rent, but we also have to, working with other agencies, think about the income side. And so we're doing that in a number of ways, of course, by having an aggressive economic development strategy, but even just within our projects, new requirements for more targeted hiring, for instance, for all of our projects. more MWBE participation, so critical to that. And of course, this all happens in the context of administration that is pushing so aggressively on a number of very progressive policies, whether it's paid sick leave, higher minimum wage, paid parental leave, even universal pre-kindergarten, the types of things that allow working families to start balancing the equation in favor of these families across the city. The last thing that I'll mention, which I know will be a topic of conversation, is that we're doing all this work in the face of incredibly strong headwinds coming from Washington, D.C. While our capital budget is city funded, I mentioned $10 billion earlier, 86% of HPD's expense budget is federally funded. And that is the funding that really helps us advance all of our work to protect the city's housing stock, to fill gaps in terms of supportive housing, in terms of home ownership. We're the 5th largest issuer of Section 8 vouchers. 39,000 households rely on this program. And we're living in a world, as many of you know, where with the cuts that the president has proposed for the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, a lot of those programs are really under threat. But we are very focused on resisting those cuts by working with different coalitions across the country, by really showing the impact of our work on the ground, and by making sure that Washington, D.C. does not walk away from its obligations to the people of this city. And so while it's a very sobering situation, given the extraordinary constellation of people who are part of the affordable housing community, the advocacy of different legislators and different levels of government, and of course New Yorkers who are holding us accountable, I'm optimistic that we will be able to continue to fight for what we believe is right and is deserved by the people of this city. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much. Abby, why don't you get us started?
Well, it's a very tough climate to be working in with the federal government. I think that I wanted to go back to the you brought up, you know, the mayor's investment in the lowest income housing and in really making sure that the Housing New York plan and all the new units created are really reaching the lowest incomes. And I just wanted to ask with that, you know, that there are still affordable housing advocates who want to see even more units for the lower incomes than the mayor has promised this spring. And you know, I understand in the past the administration has said that within like a particular building, there's the you know, you can only have so many low-income units or it jeopardizes the financial feasibility of a building. We've also heard that, you know, it's a question of number of units versus depth of affordability in the plan overall. Like, you know, there's a trade-off between how many units overall you can subsidize and the depth of the how low income those units are. But I'm just curious, like, where is your latest thinking on this? Because there are really advocates who want to see, you know, 40% of the units for families making below 40% area median income. You know, they're really pushing. So.
Yeah, no. So I appreciate that question, and certainly over the course of the last several years in the implementation of the plan, we've had, I think, very constructive, I'm not saying they're easy, but constructive conversations with a number of different organizations about how best to use the resources. The reality is for us that the affordability crisis affects families and household types of every stripe and size and shape. So there's an affordability issue for very, very low income families, for formerly homeless households, for a young person coming out of college, for our more elderly residents, and that exists across the board. And we have to have a plan that is realistic, not just about project financing of a particular building, but allows us to reach the needs of different household types and different income levels. Just to give you a very stark example, to the extent, and we've heard this before, that most of our units, more of our units should be for a family making less than, say, 30% of area median income. But if you look at a single mother, for instance, who is working full-time at a $15 an hour job, that family is actually over 30% of area median income. And I don't think anyone would say that there isn't a need for that particular household. And so it's always a balance of making sure that we are putting our resources where they are most needed, while at the same time ensuring that a project is one that is strong enough, not just that it can get built, but that it actually is healthy over time, because the last thing you want is for one of our projects to fail, not a year from now, but 5, 10 years from now, and to also recognize that need exists across all of these household types and these incomes. The recognition, of course, that we need to do more. I mean, we're always grappling with that. It's why we added another $2 billion in the capital plan, and it's why we're fighting for more funding from the federal government. I know they're telling us right now they want to give us less, but we're in a situation, given this crisis, and it's not just us, it's a number of other cities across this country, where we need more resources and not less, and we'll continue to fight that fight.
It is true, though, that the census data shows that the lowest incomes do have the two lowest income brackets do have the most rent burden, right? Way more than sort of the some of the middle income, or so. Is it really true that the whole city, like, even the middle class, needs affordable housing?
Well, yes, because I think it's true that need exists across different income levels. We are recognizing that for extremely low and very low income families, that there's a particular need, which is why we're devoting additional resources to address those issues. But if we are to continue to promote economic diversity, not just in particular buildings, but entire neighborhoods, we have to strike a balance in the plan, and that is what we have done. And I know that the conversations will continue, and they should. And even if for a number of advocates, if we disagree on how the pie needs to be sliced, I think we do all agree, which is a good thing, that that pie has to be bigger. And so our arms are linked in terms of fighting for those resources on the federal level.
Now, you've talked about the cloud that's sort of looming over most progressive local governments, which is the President Donald Trump's administration. And while some people may feel your plan isn't ambitious enough, or some people feel it's too ambitious, the real issue is the money. And you talked about fighting for that federal aid. But is there a contingency plan in place just in case you don't get that money?
So we are absolutely analyzing all scenarios given the strong headwinds that are coming from Washington. But what we don't want to do is signal that we are able to absorb those cuts, because that would be disingenuous. The interesting thing in our advocacy over the course of the last several months, let's take something like the community development block grants. So we receive about $150 million in each year. That's what helps us fund a lot of our enforcement work, housing litigation work, emergency repairs, emergency shelters, really critical to protecting the city's housing stock. And CDBG, that's how we use it here in New York City. What's interesting is if you look at how CDBG is used in other parts of the country, in red states and in purple states, it's as effective and as critical and leverages a lot of additional funding. So in places like Provo, Utah, it's used to fund senior housing. In places like Jackson, Mississippi, it's used to fund first-time home buyer assistance programs. And the thing that is true, and I'm hoping, and we're making sure that our legislators are hearing this every day, affordable housing and programs like CDBG, these are bipartisan issues. It's not only big cities, only progressive cities use this funding effectively. All cities use it. All cities need it because the affordable housing crisis is a national one. 1 in 4 renters nationwide spend more than half of their income on rent. So this is not just something that's a New York City problem, it's a national problem. We all have to do a better job, I think, in the affordable housing community of making sure that that is a message and a story that is told. And as importantly, which I think is the biggest challenge here, is we are living in a time where there's so many threats to immigrant rights, threats to education, threats to the environment. And in that sea of so many threats, making sure that housing does not get lost is difficult. But that is my job, that's the job of people who, my counterparts in other cities, and it's a critical one because housing is a basic necessity. It's critical to people's safety and well-being, and we have to do a much better job, I think, of getting that message across, and certainly the media can help us in that fight.
So when talking about sort of these different affordable housing projects that are being constructed in so many parts of the city, there's always this question of, is there, who are the people who are accessing those, even if they qualify income-wise, what are the, yesterday the public advocate shared with us a report that they just released that that is saying that although they commend HPD for and they commend the administration for having reformed the tenant selection criteria, so you can't be rejected just based on credit history alone. They think there could be more reforms made, and they would like the public advocate would like to see HPD disallow developers from rejecting applicants based on the combination of credit history and eviction history and debt that can currently, result in a rejection. They would like to see tenants evaluated based on just their ability to pay the rent going forward. And they point out that, in a lot of the low-income communities where this housing is being built, they're worried that, the people who need it the most are not going to end up getting it because of these barriers. So I'm curious how you respond to those recommendations.
So we have, I haven't read the report that you're mentioning, but what I do know is that we've worked very, very closely with the public advocate and so many other elected officials on ways for us to do our work more effectively. And as it relates specifically to Housing Connect or the lottery system, a couple of ways that we have really focused on accessibility. And I think there are a few ways to kind of unpack that. There's accessibility in making sure that New Yorkers know how to navigate the system and that their experience with us is one where they understand what it means to apply, but we're also using that as an opportunity to provide other resources. So we actually, for instance, have done work with the Department of Consumer Affairs, with the Office of Financial Empowerment, to ensure that people not only, and in different languages, know how to access our system, but in the course of that to offer financial counseling, right? Because they may not be ready today, but there are other ways we can help once they are part of this interaction. The second way, in terms of accessibility, is to make sure that we are not making it harder or using kind of the right thresholds or either asking the right questions or not asking questions we're not supposed to in order for people to have the most opportunity to qualify for for the lotteries, whether that's looking a combination of credit history and other issues. And that work is ongoing, and I'd very much, after this, happy to spend time to look over the proposal. We're always open to finding ways to improve that system that allows us to make those matches most effectively while making sure that it is not screening out those who most need our help.
Well, to piggyback off of that,
Yeah.
I'll talk about another report. This Tuesday, New York City Councilmember Jumaane Williams and the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development jointly released the latter's annual How is Affordable Housing Threatening Your Neighborhood report. The risks chart outlines various indicators of threats to affordable housing laid out on a neighborhood-by-neighborhood basis. And one of the trends in this year's chart was what they called a significant percentage increase in neighborhoods with severe overcrowding, meaning families are doubling up or tripling up in order to make rent. For example, in the Kingsbridge Heights section of the Bronx, 32%, there was a 32% increase in severe overcrowding. In Sunset Park, Brooklyn, it was just over 10%. So according to the report, doubling and tripling up is usually a precursor to increase in homeless shelter applications. How is the city trying to combat the problem of families shacking up with other families in order to survive?
So I am familiar with that report, and ANHD has always done such terrific work to help deepen the research and our understanding of the different issues. And what the report tells me is that the crisis, in some ways, it's not 100% surprising because it confirms what I think a lot of people are experiencing and what we know. It's why we have such an aggressive housing plan. It's that the affordability crisis in this city is so stark. And when you look at the demographics, for instance, of individuals and families that are in our homeless shelters, a significant fraction of them are working families. And you know, if you reflect on that for a little bit, it's very sobering. It means that we have to work with even more urgency in order to preserve more affordable housing, in order to bring online more affordable housing. And I think that's where a lot of the complexity and difficulty of the work happens. So you have a report like this that shows severe overcrowding. We know the strain in terms of our homeless shelter system. It's why we are really focused both on preserving but also on creating more affordable housing. It's why we're focused on all of the rezonings and the neighborhood plans. And of course, each and every one of those is really hard, and it comes with it a lot of tough conversations on the ground. But until such time as we are making a meaningful dent in the supply of housing in this city, these problems will continue. And while those conversations in each of the projects is so difficult, it's why we have to keep moving forward. Of course, doing it in a way where we are conscientious of and responding to criticism on the ground and opposition on the ground. But the report just tells me that we have to double down on that and move even faster.
Okay, some questions have come from the folks here. One is, how many units have been taken out of rent stabilization or the affordable housing market in general because of Airbnb, and what are you doing about it?
I don't have the precise number for that. I think in general, of course, we have been concerned about units that are coming out of rent regulation. It is why the preservation part of our job is so important, because as programs that we may have and projects we may have financed in the past are coming out of their compliance period or regulatory period, we are reaching back out very proactively to all of those owners so that we can have them stay in programs that ensure longer affordability in exchange, of course, for assistance on our end, whether that's loan for rehabilitation, et cetera. And so I'm happy to try to find that number. I don't have it off the top of my head, but we are always concerned when there are risks that take affordable units off the market.
This question is from Greg McQueen of Manhattan Times. HPD is involved in a proposal to redevelop the Inwood Library into a building that includes affordable housing along with the new library. HPD has been criticized for making its community board presentations in English only, and and for posting materials on the web in English only. What will your agency do to engage Spanish-speaking residents of this community, which is more than 70% Latino?
This is an incredibly important issue to me. I am a first-generation immigrant. Being able to understand, access, engage with government on so many levels is one that I take very, very personally. We in the agency are very committed to making sure that there is the right type of access in terms of language in all of our programs. There was an unfortunate meeting of the community board where there wasn't a translator. It's something that we will correct for the future because it's important. I mean, our job is to provide information about all of our projects in all of the right languages, and so it's certainly something that we are paying very, very close attention to for Inwood Library and for other projects across the city.
On a related note, and these are questions we ask each of our newsmakers, does your office advertise in community and ethnic media? If so, how much, and who makes that decision?
Yeah. I don't know how much. If there are, we do have quite a number of programs that we want to make sure are disseminated in the appropriate fashion, and so I would certainly love the opportunity, working with our communications department, to find ways where we can, where appropriate, do more of that.
Related question, who should media organizations contact in your office? What's the best way to do that?
Juliet, who is right here, and we'll be sure to share that information.
Okay. Liana Zagar from Brooklyner. How many resources in the current budget are being dedicated to make sure that NYCHA housing is storm resilient and that 5 years after Sandy, all damage, mold remediation included, has been dealt with? NYCHA
is not in my portfolio, but we'd be more than happy to speak with our colleagues at NYCHA to find that answer for you.
I understand that they are a separate agency, but they, if any other landlord came to you and said, hey, we need some help making our affordable housing, up to code and available, you would be able to get involved.
So we would, and either through providing kind of the most up-to-date, certainly if it's in our project, the design guidelines on resiliency, but connecting to the vast resources across the administration that are available to owners who want to make sure they're doing the right thing because of climate change issues.
And before I go back to the my colleagues here, since NYCHA is on the table, your agency and NYCHA put out this joint release just a couple of days ago, indicating that there's going to be a request for proposals to build 100% affordable housing in or near housing authority developments. And that's, I think the total was about 800 units that are being sought. What's the definition of affordable, and would residents who are already on NYCHA's 10-year waiting list be first in line for those units or get any kind of preference for those?
So in all of our RFPs, certainly 100%, and with these, our intent is always to maximize the number of affordable units and to reach the deepest levels. And so as those responses come in, that's how they will be judged. And a lot of the previous and what we've seen in other sites is that the proposals that are most compelling are the ones that allow us to reach a range of incomes from families who are extremely low income to other levels. There's a second part of your question. If you're already on the NYCHA waiting list, do you get any kind of, or frankly, even as a current tenant of NYCHA, do you get any kind of preference in whatever comes online? There is a preference system that exists for NYCHA developments, and I'd be happy to follow up on the specifics given this RFP. Okay, and just to be clear, when you say affordable housing, for this particular batch of RFPs,
it could be 80-20, it could be 70-30, it could be 50-50. There's no
No,
particular
it's
thing that you have in
100
mind?
It's 100% affordable, but the different, the levels of affordability for all of those units, we will wait to see what comes back in terms of the submissions, and then and consider them based on that. But we
Okay.
always want to reach the deeper levels, of course.
And it's not in particular, it's not pitched in particular to whatever's going on in that community board or that development.
I think the most successful proposals are often the ones that really take into consideration the context in which each and every one of the NYCHA developments or their projects is happening in. So that's what we expect.
Okay.
Piggybacking on Greg's Inwood Library question, that project has also been, there are some members of the community who would like to see that Inwood Library be, if it is redeveloped as a community land trust. To just give a one-sentence summary, like the idea of the land title being separate from the title to the buildings, which provides a sort of extra accountability to make sure that buildings remain permanently affordable. We know that HPD has released a request for expressions of interest back in January, and that a lot of different groups are eagerly awaiting to find out basically I think that request for expressions of interest basically, right, was HPD saying, okay, groups out there that are interested in community land trusts, tell us what you would do, you would do with city land, with city subsidies, how this tool would actually benefit the city. And so a lot of groups are interested in finding out what HPD will end up saying in response. And so I'm wondering if you can give us any of your latest thoughts on the community land trust model.
Of course. Excuse me. So specifically for the Inwood Library project, it has always been our intent, and we will do it, that the library component of the project will always remain under city ownership. For the rest of the project, we have not yet determined whether a ground lease or community land trust is whether those are workable models for the development, but we have certainly heard loud and clear from the community that it is one of the things they want us to consider, and we are certainly doing that. More generally, as it relates to community land trust, we did release the RFEI earlier in the year. We received a robust set of responses. We are reviewing all of them right now. And the question for us in reviewing them and really figuring out how best to maximize the use of community land trusts is what's the value add of a CLT given all of the other tools that we have at HPD. And so it's a question that is we're answering as we are reviewing each and every one of the responses. I am optimistic that there will be a lot of innovative ideas that we are going to be able to advance. I of course can't disclose the contents of the submissions, given that it's a procurement. I think it won't solve all of the problems in the world, but I think it will be a very good tool to add to our toolkit in terms of ensuring neighborhood stability, permanence, community ownership. And so everyone should stay tuned as we move forward with that RFEI.
Well, speaking of staying tuned and communities having a stake in things, while I live in Queens now, I'm born and raised in the Bronx. And I've been reading about the city's plan to rezone the 73 square block commercial stretch around Jerome Avenue, stretching from 167th to 183rd Streets. I'm actually heading up there today, later on, to get my haircut on 183rd and Jerome Avenue. The plan calls for over 3,200 new units. I'm not sure if they state if there'll be any affordable ones. I'm assuming there will be some. I've had discussions with several residents up there who are really worried about their businesses being pushed out as well as their living space. What's the city doing to assure these people that they'll have a stake in the results of a potential rezoning?
Yeah. The neighborhood plan for Jerome, and we've worked with the community, I think over a year now, maybe a little bit longer, to make sure, as we have been, and it's a different type of initiative, but a lot of the same issues, as with Brownsville, that we understand what the capacity is for additional residential units, and of course this, like with every other neighborhood plan, will have a significant potential for affordable housing. I mean, it's why we're doing it. So that is, and that's always a combination of looking at what the potential development sites are along the entire corridor, what the public sites are, which of course we have more control over. And so that process will run its course. There are a number of small businesses along the corridor, and in Jerome, like with others, we work very, very closely, for instance, with the Department of Small Business Services, so that we understand what the corridor needs are, and as one strategy. And that work does not have to start when the rezoning is done or 2 years after the rezoning is done. That work is actually happening now, and an assessment, a community district needs assessment was done with all of the merchants of the corridor in order to identify what those strategies are to really help them even today, whether that's storefront improvements, whether that is more support for MWBEs in the corridor, access to training, access to other loans, et cetera. And then as it relates to, there are a number of auto-related uses as well along the corridor. And in the zoning proposal, worked very, city planning, I know, has been quite focused on really understanding where the displacement risks are most severe, and ensuring that that the zoning proposal reflects that. And so in the end, it of course is always a balance. It's not, the rezoning has not certified yet, but we're want to make sure that we are simultaneously creating the capacity for residential, maximizing affordable housing, addressing the needs of small businesses, providing more job opportunities. And the last thing is, to the extent that there are infrastructure needs in the area, parks, sewers, et cetera, in this administration, one of the newer tools that we have is something called the Neighborhood Development Fund. So the mayor has funded, it's about $1 billion, so that for each of the rezonings, there is already a fund from which to draw to support infrastructure investments in all of the rezoning areas.
Okay, another rezoning question. Are you familiar with the Chinatown Working Group rezoning plan? On the one hand, they want to limit the height of buildings. On the other hand, they need the affordable housing. How does HPD deal with this issue?
I don't know a chapter and verse, although the balance and of wanting to preserve scale in an area and at the same time maximize affordability, that is, it's a tension that we confront everywhere. And when we do our jobs well, it's a balance that we are able to strike. And that happens in a couple of ways. One is to ensure that we are being as aggressive as we need to be on the preservation front, so that whether it's in places like Chinatown or other parts of the city in particular where there's a large percentage of rent-regulated apartments, we're doing everything we can to keep them affordable over the long term, to the extent that there is new development. And then that's where we have to, with city planning, work very, very closely to achieve that balance that provides, from a zoning point of view, the capacity to build more, but is respectful of the larger context in which the larger context of the neighborhood.
This is from Angie at Al Arabi newspaper. Are there any plans for new immigrants? Because many would like to know about housing programs when they first move to New York and spend years struggling to pay rent.
So all of our housing programs, and lottery, of course, it's open to everyone as long as you're eligible. And as I mentioned before, part of the work that we need to make sure we're doing the most effective job at is educating all New Yorkers, in particular new immigrants, about what those opportunities are, how to apply to to our lottery system, how to navigate that process, what it means to understand what all of the available lotteries are. And so, and I think that is working with community and ethnic media in different communities. I'd love to explore doing more of that so that this information gets pushed out as effectively as it needs to be.
Related question, what are the statistics or percentage of households or individuals accepted into the housing lottery?
I don't have the particular statistic. What I do know is that there is much more demand. There's incredible demand for affordable housing in the city. And that statistic is likely to be very, very sobering. And it's why we are working as hard as we can to implement the mayor's housing plan. And it's why we are fighting as hard as we are to get more resources, because clearly there is a very deep affordability crisis in this city, and we have to work with as much urgency as we need.
Okay, another question. You say you don't want to make it sound like you don't need federal funding. Does that mean if the city were to lose this fight for federal funding, projects will not be completed? What kind of alternatives is the city looking at, and what can citizens do to help?
Yeah, so citizens can do a lot to help. New Yorkers and really anyone in this country really communicating with our legislators about the need to not just preserve these programs, but to increase support for them. As I mentioned, there are so many issues that I know, members of Congress are fighting for, and New Yorkers can be as vocal as I know they are able to be about the need to protect our affordable housing programs. In terms of the budget issue in general, as I mentioned before, in terms of the housing plan, on the capital end, so a lot of what drives our ability to implement the housing plan, that is city funded. And so the city contribution, $10 billion over the course of 10 years, so that we can have a very aggressive forward march in the plan, that is there. To the extent that there are cuts to any of the programs that I mentioned earlier, CDBG, Home, Section 8, that will be a conversation, and we've analyzed all of those risks, but that we'll have to see what the full picture is in terms of those cuts. So to give you an example, I said CDBG, we have 150 million. Other agencies like Parks, like Department of Small Business Services and City Planning also have programs that are funded by CDBG. We have to see what those cuts are and then make decisions as a city about what the best way is to address those cuts. First and foremost, our approach is going to be to mitigate any impact to services for the residents of our city. But it would be premature, as I mentioned earlier, to start absorbing them now, because we can't let Washington, D.C. walk away from its obligation.
Yeah. In neighborhoods like Jerome and other ones where the rezoning plans are being considered, there's been a call for the use of the engagement with more nonprofit affordable housing developers, and there's been some frustration voiced by some nonprofit affordable housing developers that they aren't being given priority because they feel like they, one, have often been able to reach the lowest incomes, and two, that they are rooted in community organizing and mission driven. But I've heard some people express hope that under your leadership there may be some room for some more engagement with nonprofits, And I'm curious, sort of, what is your thinking on their worth, and whether, and what could you do to give them a bigger share of the pie if you think that would be a good idea.
So the success of the Housing New York plan depends on a deep bench of partners. For-profit developers, not-for-profit developers, other community-based organizations, tenant advocates. We cannot do this if we don't have full participation. There is already significant participation of not-for-profits in our work. I've spoken in the 3 months that I've been there. I've had a lot of really honest and productive conversations with not-for-profit organizations about how that partnership can be even more deepened. But just to name, I have to first disagree with the premise that they are shut out, because that is certainly not the intent, and they are already very active participants. Do we need to do more in order to make sure that we are have as much competition for in the RFPs? Yes, and I think it's reducing the barriers to entry. I think it's the same issue that we have heard from MWBE developers, that we need to do everything that we can to address some of the barriers to entry, not because of IRS status, but because not-for-profit organizations have long anchored so many communities, are so mission-driven. And it's why we've done a number of things, for instance, within various programs that are about addressing those barriers. So we have an acquisition loan fund, for instance, that's been recapitalized and expanded, and not-for-profits, unlike for-profits, are eligible to borrow more than the value of the site. As an example, we are supporting an entity called the Joint Operating Entity, which is really a nonprofit collaborative that asset manages affordable multifamily properties, has a lot of not-for-profit, of course, engagement and participation in it. We have specific programs that primarily do go to not-for-profit organizations, and we are looking at now ways for our RFPs and RFEIs, those documents, to really underscore not IRS status, but those underlying objectives that you mentioned earlier, wanting to make sure that we have respondents who can deliver the most in terms of community engagement, who have really have community development as part of their response. And so I imagine that that not-for-profit organizations will have been and will continue to bring a lot to those proposals. And it's a way, I think, where we can move forward. Because the one thing I'll say is that there is always room, because we're New York and these are complicated issues, for very healthy debate about what the priorities should be, how the pie gets split up, what the ratio is of for-profit versus not-for-profit. Those are debates that can and should and can and will continue. But we also have to, in a world where, and you both mentioned different reports that that make even starker the need to accelerate the pace of our work in the face of all of these threats. I also think, and I've mentioned this to different groups, we have to find a way to come together on those issues in which we have common cause. And I think the battle and the ongoing kind of fight with, in terms of the cuts on the federal level, is one of those areas.
Time for a just a quick follow-up, just like, it's interesting how you're saying, the way to help nonprofits participate is through making sure barriers to entry are removed. I think I've heard some nonprofits say they want to be given preference or priority in the RFPs, and that's their perspective. And I'm curious, do you feel like that might not be the right step?
Yeah, no, I have heard that, and it's the preference for the IRS status that I think kind of misses the point. The preference should be for the underlying values, objectives that not-for-profits naturally should be very competitive in. As I mentioned before, a real commitment to community engagement, really understanding community development objectives. Because at the end of the day, we know we can't do this work alone. We want to work with as many not-for-profits as we can. Our job is to build affordable housing for the people of the city, and we need all the partners that we are able to really enlist in this fight.
With all of this, with affordable housing and developments and sort of trying to redevelop neighborhoods and make sure we have housing, there is that in the meantime. In the meantime, for some people might be shelters, but you have shelters versus the not in my backyard types. So in terms of everyone coming together for a common goal, how is the city trying to convince citizens of New York that some of the options they have on the table for homeless shelters are necessary?
Yeah, no, there is a need for housing of all types, and a need for different communities to really share in the responsibility to address the affordability crisis. And just to give you an example, our work to find permanent housing for formerly homeless households is very robust. We have now a homeless requirement in most of our term sheets. We have a very robust supportive housing program that is permanent housing for many different communities, including the formerly homeless. Those, to the extent that they have to go through public approvals, those conversations are harder in some communities than in others, but we expect that. And our job is to not shy away from those conversations. Our job is to make sure we are fighting for the people who most need our help. I'm not saying it's easy, and we work very, very closely with each council person so that there is full information about what we are trying to do. I know that my colleague, Commissioner Banks, who is leading the blueprint in terms of homelessness generally in the city, is doing the same. But it's very much a challenge.
Okay, I'm going to sneak in one last question, and then we will let you go, Commissioner. This is from NTD TV. New York City Council members have proposed a series of bills to protect tenants. They include creating a rebuttable presumption, raising civil penalties, et cetera. From HPD's perspective, do you think these bills will reduce the affordable housing crisis, or will they make landlords quit the markets?
Protecting tenants from harassment is something we are incredibly focused on. We do a lot in this area. Let's start with that. Whether it is our enforcement work, our housing litigation work, working with the Tenant Harassment Task Force that I mentioned earlier with our partners in the state. It's the administration funding more than $60 million so that there is tenant representation and legal services. There's a long list of ways that we are very, very, very focused on tenant harassment. There are a number of bills, and then the ones that you mentioned are some of them. We have to look at each and every one of them, and we always start from a place where, of course, we agree on the underlying objective of preventing tenant harassment. And the analysis has to be for each of the bills, whether or not it actually accomplishes that, whether it accomplishes it in a cost-effective way, whether it accomplishes it in a way where we're not stifling development, because the last thing we want is to, for instance, slow the development of affordable housing. It's always a balance. We're doing that with these bills as we do with any other. But we, for the most part, end up in a place with our colleagues at City Council where the bills that are passed are ones that we believe advance the common goal and do so in a way that's fiscally responsible and operationally smart.
Okay, that brings us to the end of our time. Thank you for coming and giving us a wealth of information. We got all of our questions answered, and I know it's tough on a Friday afternoon, but we thank you for coming by.
Thank you for inviting me here.
Okay. I know there are almost